The boy was crying, and Frances Maddox had run out of ways to make him stop. She stood in the doorway of the Dusty Creek General Store with her 7-year-old son clutched against her side, and the sound coming out of him was not the ordinary sound of a child's tantrum. It was something older, something broken at the root. It was the sound of a boy who had asked a question and received an answer that had shattered the world he thought he lived in. "He said my papa was a coward," the boy Thomas choked out between heaving breaths. "He said my papa ran away. He said everybody in Dusty Creek knows it and you lied to me." Frances felt the words land like separate blows. The late afternoon sun hammered the dirt street of Dusty Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1882, and she stood very still because if she moved she feared she would fall apart entirely. Her jaw was tight. Her hands were trembling. The secret she had carried for 3 years, the dark past she had buried under careful silences and gentle half-truths, had just been ripped open in a public street by the careless cruelty of Hector Vane's oldest son, who was 12, and had learned his meanness from a grown man who had plenty to spare. She was about to kneel down and gather Thomas up and say whatever words came first, when a shadow fell across them both. The man was not particularly tall, but he was broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested he had spent his life moving heavy things with quiet determination. He wore a plain canvas shirt the color of dried grass and trousers that had been patched twice at the knee. His hat was brown and battered, its brim honest and unadorned. He was leading a bay horse by the reins, and he had clearly been heading somewhere else entirely, but he had stopped. He crouched down. Not in the way men sometimes crouched before small children, with exaggerated cheerfulness or clumsy condescension. He crouched down the way a man crouches when he wants to be at the same level as something he is taking seriously. His eyes, which were the color of creek water in November, looked directly at Thomas, and his voice when he spoke was low and unhurried and absolutely certain. "A boy needs someone steady," he said, "and I am going to be that man." Frances Maddox stared at him. Thomas had gone very quiet in the way that children do when something unexpected cuts through their misery and arrests their full attention. The man held Thomas's gaze for another moment, then looked up at Frances, and what she saw in his face was not pity, which she despised, and not hunger, which she had learned to fear in the faces of men who looked at widows or near widows or women whose stories were complicated. What she saw was something quieter and more dangerous than either of those things. It was resolve. She would think about that moment for a long time afterward, and she would come to understand that it was the beginning of everything, though she could not have known it then. All she knew then was that her son had stopped crying, and that the man straightening up before her had the kind of face that made you feel, irrationally and immediately, that he had never told a lie in his life. His name was Cyrus Morgan. She did not know that yet. She would know it by sundown, and she would know it very differently a year from then, and she would know it differently still on the morning she finally let herself stop fighting the feeling that had been growing in her chest since that first dusty afternoon in the street outside the general store. But first, she had to go back to where it had started. Back to the trap that had been set for her long before she knew the territory existed, and the betrayal that had driven her to Dusty Creek in the first place, and the desperate gamble of a woman who had run out of safer options. Frances Maddox had been born Frances Halley in Kansas City, Missouri, in 1856, which made her 26 years old in the autumn of 1882. She had grown up in a house that smelled of bread and lamp oil and her mother's lavender water, and she had married at 21, which everyone agreed was a sensible age. The man she married was named Gerald Maddox, and he was handsome in the easy, uncomplicated way of men who have never had to try very hard at anything, and she had loved him with the full, earnest attention of a young woman who had not yet learned to be cautious with her love. Gerald had come to her with a business proposition wrapped in romance. He had swept through Kansas City talking about the railroad opportunities opening up in West Texas, about land that was cheap and rich with possibility, about a cattle operation that would make their fortune inside of 5 years. His dark eyes had been bright with it. Frances had believed him because she wanted to believe him, and because she was 21, and the wanting is very strong at 21. They had come to Dusty Creek in the spring of 1878, which was a town that had grown up around a water source in the dry country southeast of Abilene. There were perhaps 300 people in Dusty Creek then, a proper main street with a hotel and a sheriff's office and 2 saloons and the general store, and the surrounding land was parceled into ranches that ran cattle north to the railheads. It was not a romantic landscape. It was vast and unforgiving and beautiful in a way that Frances came to understand only slowly, the way you come to understand music in a language you do not yet speak. Gerald had purchased 40 acres on the edge of town on credit he could not easily sustain, and he had set about building a cattle operation with more enthusiasm than knowledge. Thomas had been born in 1875. 3 years before they left Kansas City, which meant he was 3 when they arrived in Dusty Creek, and he had no memory of anywhere else. For Thomas, this flat and enormous country was simply the world. For 2 years, things had been survivable. Gerald worked the land and Frances kept the house and managed the small kitchen garden and took in laundry from the hotel to supplement what the cattle brought in. She was not unhappy, precisely. She was busy, which is sometimes close enough to the same thing. Then Gerald's hidden motive had revealed itself, quietly at first and then with accelerating violence. He had a weakness for cards. She had known this in Kansas City, but it had seemed small there, a social habit, an amiable vice. In Dusty Creek, without the moderating structure of a city, and with a saloon 3 streets away that ran games 6 nights a week, it became something else entirely. It became a compulsion that ate money faster than the ranch could produce it, and faster than Frances could replace it by any honest means available to her. By the summer of 1879, Gerald owed money to men who collected debts in ways that left marks. By the autumn of that year, he had borrowed against the house itself, the 40 acres, the cattle. Frances had not known this until the papers were shown to her by a man named Hector Vane, who was the largest landowner in the county, and who had a particular interest in acquiring property from men who could not pay. Hector Vane was the kind of man the frontier sometimes produced, which was a man with enough intelligence to accumulate power, and not enough scruple to be troubled by how he used it. He was thick-necked and prosperous-looking, with small, careful eyes, and a voice like the sound of money being counted. He had bought Gerald's debts, every one of them, and he had presented Frances with the arithmetic in a way that made perfectly clear he considered her own person to be among the assets that might be negotiated. Frances had not hit him, though she had wanted to. She had thanked him with cold precision for the information and asked him to leave her home, and when he was gone, she had sat at the kitchen table for a very long time thinking about the shape of her situation. 2 weeks later, Gerald was gone. Not dead, not taken by an act of God or random violence. Gone deliberately, as in packed a bag and rode north and sent a letter from Abilene that was 4 sentences long and did not contain an apology. He had found, the letter said, an opportunity in Wyoming that required him to move quickly. He hoped she would understand. He was sorry about the debts. She had sat with that letter for a long time too. The betrayal was complete and architectural, built into the foundation of everything he had told her. The dark past she was left with was entirely his making. She was 23 years old with a 5-year-old son and a mortgaged property, and a powerful enemy who had already indicated his particular idea of how her problems might be solved, and she had no family within 500 miles. She had not solved any of it quickly. She had spent a year clawing at it, working the laundry operation to its limits, trying to run the cattle with hired hands she could barely pay, negotiating with Vane in ways that made her feel like she was moving through a room full of hidden traps. She had managed to keep the house for that year. But by the summer of 1880, the debt had swelled with interest into a figure she genuinely could not reach, and Vane had foreclosed with the cheerful efficiency of a man performing a task he has been looking forward to. She had moved with Thomas into the 2 rooms above the saddle maker's shop on the main street, which cost her $4 a month, and she had begun the grim arithmetic of deciding what came next. What had come next, in the curious way that life sometimes offered resources from unexpected directions, was a woman named Dora Capwell, who ran the seamstress operation next door to the saddle maker, and who had a generous nature and an extensive information network built from years of fitting women's clothing in a community where women talked during their fittings. Cyrus Morgan is looking for a housekeeper, Dora had told her one morning in the autumn of 1880. Frances had looked up from the seam she was helping stitch. The ranch out on the Caprock Road, the very one. He runs about 400 head of cattle out there, good land, well managed. He lost his housekeeper in the spring when she married that drummer who came through. He's got a crew of 4 and no one to manage the house, and he's not the kind of man who manages well in chaos. Dora had paused with her needle in the air. He pays fair, better than fair actually, and he is the kind of man who would not cause you trouble. Frances had learned to be precise about what that meant. You are certain of that? I have known Cyrus Morgan for 11 years, Dora had said, and I have never once heard a woman say an unkind word about him. That is a notable record in this county. Frances had gone out to the Morgan ranch the following week. It was a solid property, nothing showy, with a main house of limestone and timber that had been built to last rather than to impress. The yard was clean. The fences were maintained. The cattle she could see from the road were fat and calm. These details mattered to her because they were evidence of character. A man who kept his fences and his cattle told you something about how he managed his obligations. Cyrus Morgan had come out of the barn when she rode up, wiping his hands on a cloth. He was 31 then, with that particular steadiness of men who had spent years in physical work that required patience more than violence. He had looked at her directly, and without the sliding quality she had learned to watch for in men's eyes, and he had listened to what she was proposing without interrupting. She had told him she was a woman who had been left in difficult circumstances and needed reliable work. She had told him she had a son who would be well-behaved and helpful and not in the way. She had told him she was a capable housekeeper, a capable cook, and that she could also do basic accounts if the occasion demanded. She had not told him about Gerald or about Vane or about the debt, because those things were hers to carry and not his to know. He had said he would pay her $12 a month plus room and board, which was exactly what she needed. He had shown her and Thomas the rooms at the back of the main house that had been used by his previous housekeeper, 2 connected rooms with a proper fireplace and a window that looked out over the yard toward the distant line of hills. Thomas had pressed his nose against the window glass and said that he could see a horse. Frances had agreed to the arrangement and had moved in that same week. The 2 years between that arrangement and the afternoon outside the general store had been the most complicated 2 years of her life, which was saying something given what had preceded them. They had been complicated because of what she had not anticipated, which was Cyrus Morgan himself. She had expected to find an employer. She had prepared herself for the particular social geometry of being a woman in a subordinate household position, for the navigation required, for the maintenance of appropriate distances and careful dignities. She had drawn her borders clearly in her own mind before she arrived, and she had intended to hold them without drama. What she had not prepared for was a man who seemed to have absolutely no interest in any of those borders because he was too busy being exactly what Dora Capwell had described: steady, honest, unhurried. A man who said good morning to her like it was something he meant, who ate what she cooked without complaint but expressed genuine appreciation when it was good, who had a way of speaking to Thomas that was both direct and kind, treating the boy with the same seriousness he applied to any matter that deserved his attention. He had not made a single advance toward her in 2 years. He had not looked at her sideways or said things that required interpretation. He had paid her on time every month and thanked her for her work and gone about his business. And this, paradoxically, was what had made her situation so desperately complicated. Because the absence of pressure had left her with no armor against the much slower and far more dangerous process of simply coming to know him. She had learned that he was from Tennessee originally, come west at 19 with his older brother, who had died of a fever in the summer of 1873 and was buried on a hill 3 miles east of the ranch. She had learned that he read at night, real books, not dime novels, whatever came through the trading post or could be ordered from the catalog. She had learned that he was patient with difficult horses and quick to laugh at himself, and slow to speak when he was uncertain. She had learned that the 4 men who worked for him, weathered and various men named Oak and Sully and the brothers Trent and Bart, were loyal in a way that spoke well of what he gave them in return. She had learned all of this without intending to, in the way that you learn the contours of a landscape you are living inside of, and by the time she understood what had happened, it was simply the fact of things. She was in danger of a feeling she had sworn herself against, and the feeling was not convenient and not safe and not asked for, and she had no idea what to do with it. So she had held her borders anyway. She had been warm because warmth was natural to her, and she could not entirely suppress it. But she had been correct, professionally correct, in the way of a woman who is performing the maintenance of a boundary against pressure that has no name. And then had come the afternoon outside the general store, and Cyrus Morgan had crouched down in the dust and spoken to her weeping son with absolute certainty, and everything she had been carefully maintaining had cracked straight through. The drive back to the ranch in Cyrus's wagon was quiet in a way that was not uncomfortable, which was itself a kind of intimacy Frances had not asked for. Thomas sat between them on the wagon bench, still sniffling but calmed, one small hand resting against the knee of the man beside him in that unconscious way children have of confirming proximity. Cyrus had offered to bring them back from town after the scene in the street, and Frances had been too rattled to find a reason to refuse. "He said my papa ran away," Thomas said quietly after about a mile of silence. "Is that true?" Frances opened her mouth and felt the old practiced answer forming, the gentle deflection, the protective half-truth. She had been feeding Thomas half-truths for 3 years, small careful stories designed to protect him from a wound she feared would be too large for a small boy to carry. Your papa had to go a long way away. Your papa had difficult work to do. She had never actually said to him that Gerald was coming back, but she had never said he was not. "Yes," she said. The word came out of her before she could stop it, and once it was out she could not take it back, and she found she did not want to. "Your papa left. He went away and he did not come back, and that was not right of him, and it was not about you." Thomas processed this for a long moment. His jaw was very small and very set. "He left us." "He left us? On purpose? On purpose?" Another long silence. The horses moved through the late afternoon light which lay flat and golden across the grass, and a hawk turned somewhere high above them, and Frances watched it instead of looking at either of the males beside her. "Is that why we live at Mr. Morgan's ranch?" Thomas asked. "Yes," Frances said. "We needed a safe place to be. Mr. Morgan was kind enough to provide one." Thomas thought about this for another long stretch of road. Then he looked up at Cyrus with the directness that children apply to questions they consider genuinely important. "Did you mean it?" he asked. "What you said in town, about being someone steady?" Cyrus kept his eyes on the road ahead for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the same quality it had carried in the street, that absolute absence of performance or calculation. "I did," he said, "even though you're not my papa." "Being someone's father isn't always about where you come from," Cyrus said. "Sometimes it's about where you decide to go." Frances felt something in her chest do something she could not entirely control, and she looked at the hawk again very deliberately, and reminded herself about the importance of careful dignity and appropriate distances. But she was aware, as she had not been quite so acutely aware before that those distances had been shrinking for 2 years without her permission. Thomas absorbed Cyrus's answer with the solemnity of a small philosopher. "Okay," he said, and leaned slightly against Cyrus's arm in a way that was so natural and uncalculated that it nearly broke Frances open entirely. That evening, after Thomas was in bed, Frances found Cyrus on the porch in the dark. This was not unusual. He often sat on the porch in the evenings, sometimes with a book and the lamp, sometimes just sitting. She had joined him there before, sometimes, on evenings when the house felt too quiet or the stars were particularly worth looking at. She had maintained her careful geometry on those occasions, keeping to her own chair, keeping the conversation to practicalities. She did not sit in her chair. She stood at the porch railing and looked out at the dark yard and said, without planning to say anything at all, "I need to explain something to you." He waited, in the way he had of waiting, without filling the space with sound. She told him about Gerald. She told him all of it, the cards and the debt and the letter from Abilene and the foreclosure and Hector Vane's particular interest in her circumstances. She told him about the year she had spent clawing to survive before Dora Capwell had mentioned his name. She told it plainly and without self-pity, and without, she noticed, any of the shame that had accompanied the telling in her own head for 3 years. It was a strange relief, like setting down something heavy. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I had wondered about some of it. I didn't ask because it wasn't my place to ask." "You should have been told before now," she said. "You took us in without knowing." "Dora Capwell told me enough," he said. Frances looked at him. "What did she tell you?" "She told me you were the kind of woman worth knowing," he said, "and that you were in a situation that wasn't your making. That was enough for me." She stood at the railing for a long moment. The night was enormous and the stars were the violent Texas kind, too many and too bright, and she said carefully, "I want you to know that I am aware of the awkwardness of my position here. And I would not want you to feel obligated by anything you said today, to Thomas or otherwise." He looked at her then. She could feel it even before she turned to meet it. His eyes in the lamplight were serious and unhurried and very direct. "Frances," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name in 2 years of working alongside each other, "I don't say things I don't mean. I'm not built that way." The silence that followed was not comfortable or uncomfortable. It was simply honest, which was more than she was used to. She said good night and went inside and lay in her bed for a long time looking at the ceiling, and what she felt was terrifying and completely unwelcome, and also, underneath all of that, something she had almost given up on ever feeling again. She felt like something had woken up. The next morning Hector Vane rode into the yard. He arrived just as breakfast was clearing, which Frances suspected was calculated. He was on a good horse with 2 of his men behind him, and he wore a wool coat of reasonable quality and the air of a man who expects to find his arrangements in order. Frances was at the door with a dish towel in her hands when he arrived, and she felt the old cold fear move through her, the fear she had been trying to outrun for 3 years. Cyrus came from the barn at the sound of horses. He stood in the yard with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his expression easy, which was the expression, Frances had learned, that meant the opposite of easy underneath. "Morgan," Vane said from horseback, without the courtesy of dismounting. "Vane," Cyrus said, "I've come on a matter of business." Vane's small eyes went to Frances on the porch. "Mrs. Maddox will be aware of what business." Frances came down off the porch, which she had not planned to do but found she was doing. "I am aware that you foreclosed on property you manipulated my husband into debt to acquire," she said, "and I consider that business concluded." Vane smiled in the way of a man who is not particularly threatened. "There is a remaining question about the personal debts," he said. "Your husband borrowed against certain guarantees that included your own signature, Mrs. Maddox, on at least 2 documents. This was the trap, the hidden trap she had feared without knowing its exact shape. She had signed papers in those early days at Gerald's direction, without reading them with sufficient care, because she had not known yet to read everything with sufficient care. Vane had been patient. He had waited 2 years until she had found some stability, until she had something to lose again. "Those documents," Frances said, keeping her voice level, "were signed under circumstances of fraudulent misrepresentation by my husband, which I would be delighted to establish before a judge." Vane's smile became slightly less easy. "That could take considerable time and considerable money, Mrs. Maddox, neither of which you seem well positioned to invest." "What she has," Cyrus said, from where he was standing about 10 feet away, "is my interest in the matter." His voice was still easy and unhurried and absolutely certain, exactly as it had been the afternoon before in the dust of the main street. "And what I have is Nate Culpepper in Abilene, who is the best lawyer west of the Mississippi, and who I've been paying a retainer to for 6 years because I believe in being prepared." Vane looked at him. Something shifted in the small, careful eyes. "I'd also note," Cyrus continued, "that Judge Hartley in Abilene has a particular interest in the land acquisition practices you've been exercising in this county, and that 3 of your neighbors have already made statements to that effect. I'm aware of this because 2 of those neighbors are men I've known for 10 years, and one of them is my cousin." He paused. "So I'd say the matter of personal debts might be something to take up with your own lawyer before proceeding further." The silence in the yard was long and had a particular texture. Vane looked at Cyrus. He looked at Frances. He looked at the 2 men behind him who were hired hands and not particularly interested in complex legal situations. "This isn't finished," he said. "Probably not," Cyrus agreed pleasantly. "But for today I think we're done. Safe ride back to town." Vane turned his horse and rode out of the yard, and his men went with him. And Frances stood in the October morning light with the dish towel still in her hands and felt the particular sensation of a threat she had been living with for 3 years suddenly becoming something smaller. She looked at Cyrus. "Is that true?" she said. "Nate Culpepper and Judge Hartley and your cousin." "Culpepper is real and he is actually quite good," Cyrus said. "Judge Hartley is real and he is genuinely interested in Vane's practices. My cousin Marcus is real and has made statements." He paused. "I may have somewhat front-loaded all of that information for effect." "You may have," she agreed. She looked at him for another moment and then, because she could not stop it, she laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not the small, polite kind she produced for social occasions, but the real kind that comes from deep in the chest when something is genuinely funny or genuinely relieving or both. It was the first time she had laughed that way in 3 years at least, and it startled her. Cyrus was smiling at her, not the careful, polite smile of an employer. Something warmer, something that reached his eyes, something personal. "I'm going to write to Culpepper today," he said. "With your permission, I'd like to have him look at those documents. If Vane wants to push, I want to be actually prepared rather than just performing preparation." "Cyrus," she said, and then stopped, because using his given name felt significant and she was not sure she had the right to it, even though he had used hers the night before. "Frances," he said, matching it back to her, and the warmth in his voice was absolutely deliberate and she could see that he knew she knew it. "Thank you," she said. It was insufficient. She knew it was insufficient. But it was what she had. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I told Thomas I was going to be someone steady. You don't get to do that selectively." She went back inside before she said anything else, because she was not ready yet to say anything else, and she needed time to understand what was happening in her own chest before she could be trusted to speak it out loud. The letter to Nate Culpepper went to Abilene that week. Culpepper rode down the following month. A compact and energetic man of 50 who wore spectacles and spoke very quickly, and seemed to find great professional satisfaction in the documents Frances produced from the tin box she had carried with her through all of the various moves of the past 3 years. He spread the papers on the kitchen table and went through them with the focused attention of a man who enjoys finding exactly the kind of thing he was looking for. "These 2 signatures," he said, tapping the relevant pages, are on documents that were materially altered after signing. The original terms are visible under the changes if you know where to look, and I know where to look. Additionally, the debt instrument itself was constructed in a way that any court in Texas would find problematic, because it assumes spousal liability for debts contracted without full disclosure to the spouse, which is not how property law works in this state. He looked up at Frances over his spectacles. Mrs. Maddox, Hector Vane has been doing this to people for years. You are not the first, and you would not have been the last, but you are going to be the one that helps us stop it. Frances sat very straight in her chair. What does that mean, exactly? It means I want to take your case and several others to Judge Hartley and Abilene in the spring. It means Vane is going to have a very interesting year ahead of him. Culpepper glanced at Cyrus, who was leaning against the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed. You were right to contact me. Frances is the one who kept the documents, Cyrus said. That was her doing. Culpepper looked back at Frances with an expression of professional appreciation. Never throw away paper, he said. The people who win are the people who kept the paper. After Culpepper left, Frances felt the first genuine loosening of the weight she had been carrying since the summer of 1879. It did not disappear. There was still the court case ahead, and Vane was still a powerful man with resources and patience, and nothing was resolved yet. But the shape of things had changed. She was no longer simply surviving. She was, possibly, fighting back. Thomas had overheard enough of Culpepper's visit to understand something important was happening on his and his mother's behalf, and he had been watching Cyrus with an intensity that was both touching and slightly alarming since the afternoon on the main street. He had taken to following Cyrus on the morning rounds when Cyrus allowed it, which was most mornings, staying close to his boot heels and asking questions with the relentless curiosity of a 7-year-old who has found something new to be interested in. How do you know when a cow is sick? Frances heard him ask one morning from the kitchen window. You watch them, Cyrus said. You watch the way they move. A sick cow moves different from a well one. Slower on one side, or favoring a leg, or holding her head in a way that isn't right. Once you've seen enough of them being well, you know when something's off. How long does it take to know enough? Depends on how closely you're paying attention. I pay very close attention, Thomas said, with great seriousness. I've noticed that, Cyrus said, and his voice had that warmth in it that Frances had come to be able to identify through walls. She turned away from the window and did something she had not done in years, which was stand in the middle of a room and simply let herself feel what she was feeling, without immediately organizing it into something manageable. What she felt was a brightness that was also terrifying, a wanting that she had not given herself permission to have, and underneath both of those things a fear that was specific and nameable. The fear was this, that she had been wrong before, that she had loved someone with her whole heart and he had packed a bag and sent 4 sentences from Abilene, and the thing that made that betrayal most dangerous was that she had not seen it coming. She had not seen it coming because she had trusted her own judgment, and her judgment had been entirely wrong. How could she trust it now? How could she know that what she saw in Cyrus Morgan was what was actually there, rather than what she wanted to see? She had wanted to see something in Gerald Maddox too, and she had seen it, and it had not been real. The question sat in her like a stone for several weeks. She was warm with him because she could not be otherwise, but she was careful, and she could see sometimes that he noticed the careful without quite understanding its source. He did not push. That was the thing about him, the quality she kept returning to in her own private arguments with herself. He did not push. He was there, consistently and entirely, and he waited, and that waiting was itself a kind of evidence. She had not noticed, quite, how hard Hector Vane was taking the new development until the morning in December when she came into the kitchen and found Oak, one of the ranch hands, at the back door with a look on his face that she had not seen before. You need to come to the barn, he said. Mr. Morgan is not badly hurt, but you should come. Not badly hurt was a phrase that covered a great deal of ground. Frances was in the barn in 30 seconds and found Cyrus sitting on a feed crate with a cut above his left eye and a jaw that was swelling with impressive speed. Two of the other hands, Trent and Bart, were there as well, and they had the particular tightly controlled expression of men who are managing anger. "What happened?" Frances said, and was already reaching for the cloth she kept in her apron pocket, because she had spent 3 years on a working ranch and minor medical interventions were part of the job. "3 men on the South Road," Cyrus said. He sounded calm and slightly annoyed, the way a man sounds when something has inconvenienced him. "Vane's men. They had a message. The message being your face. The message being that the lawsuit is not welcome and that I should encourage you to reconsider your involvement with Culpeper." He winced as she pressed the cloth to the cut. "I should note that the message was not successfully delivered, inasmuch as one of those men is going to have trouble sitting a horse for quite some time and the other 2 ran. So, Cyrus," she pressed harder on the cut, partly from medical necessity and partly from feeling, "this is my fight. They should not be bringing it to you. It became my fight," he said simply, "the day I said what I said to Thomas." She looked at him directly. He was close, by necessity of the wound she was tending, and his eyes were level and serious, and still carrying that absolute quality of a man who has said exactly what he meant. "You are going to get yourself genuinely hurt," she said. "I'm aware of that possibility. I've written to Marcus, who is coming next week, and to Culpeper, who is moving the case timeline up. And I've sent Sully to speak to Sheriff Aldridge, who has been wanting a reason to look at Vane more closely for 2 years. He paused. "I'm not careless, Frances. I'm not rushing into this without thinking. I just want you to understand that I am not going to stop." She was still holding the cloth to his face. The barn smelled of hay and horses and the particular dusty warm smell of working animals, and the winter light came through the boards in long golden slats, and she was close enough to him that she could see the exact color of his eyes, which were not one color but several layered together. "I know," she said quietly. "I know you are not going to stop." She did not move back. Neither did he. There was a long moment that was very still and very full of things neither of them had said yet. It was Trent's voice from the back of the barn that broke it, asking about the horses, and she stepped back, and the moment released itself into the ordinary air. But it stayed in her. It stayed in her through the day and through the next days, and she turned it over and examined it the way you examine something you have found that you are not sure yet is valuable or dangerous or both. Marcus Morgan arrived the following week. He was younger than Cyrus by 2 years, which made him 29, and he had a lawyer's manner and a horseman's body, and a way of taking a room's temperature very quickly that Frances found immediately useful and slightly disconcerting. He had gray eyes that missed nothing and a dry humor he deployed sparingly and to great effect. He looked at Frances over the supper table on his first evening and said, without preamble, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" she said. "My brother is not a particularly complicated man," Marcus said. "He writes me letters that are practical and factual and occasionally mention you." The letters have been becoming less practical and more personal over the past several months, which is how I know I was going to be called down here eventually. Cyrus, across the table, looked at his cousin with an expression that communicated several things simultaneously, none of them appreciative. "More personal how?" Frances said. "He described the way you organized his account books," Marcus said, "in detail, over 2 paragraphs about account books." He picked up his fork. "That is a man in considerable difficulty." Thomas, who had been following this conversation with great attention, said, "I think Mr. Morgan is the best person I know," with the solemn authority of someone reporting a fact. The table went quiet. Then Marcus laughed, a genuine laugh, and Frances felt her face do something she could not control, a warmth that went all the way up, and Cyrus was looking at Thomas with an expression so unguarded and so unmistakably moved that she had to look at her plate. Marcus's legal work moved quickly. He joined his efforts to Culpeper's with impressive efficiency, and together they assembled a case against Vane's land acquisition practices that involved 4 other families in the county who had suffered similar treatment. The documents Frances had kept in her tin box were, Culpeper confirmed, the cleanest evidence of Vane's methods, and Frances's testimony about the altered loan documents and Vane's explicit proposition after Gerald's departure was both credible and damaging. Vane made one more approach to the ranch, in January of 1883, arriving alone this time and in the early evening, which was itself a kind of statement. Frances was in the kitchen. Cyrus came to the door. The conversation was brief. She could not hear all of it from the kitchen, but she heard enough. Vane offered to withdraw all claims in exchange for the withdrawal of the lawsuit. Cyrus told him, with his particular unhurried precision, that the lawsuit was not his to withdraw, as it was not his lawsuit. Vane said some things about what happened to people who stood between him and his business. Cyrus said, very quietly, that he had heard that, and that he was going to give Vane the opportunity to ride away from his yard before he made that statement into something that required a response. Vane rode away. Frances was standing in the kitchen doorway when Cyrus came back inside. He looked at her. She looked at him. "He is afraid," she said. "Yes," Cyrus said. "Men like him are always afraid underneath. That's why they do what they do." She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and before she fully understood what she was doing, she had put her hand against his jaw, the left one that had healed from December's bruising, and she was looking at him from very close range, and the thing inside her chest that she had been arguing with for months had simply stopped arguing. He was very still. "I have been very cautious," she said. "I have been cautious because the last time I trusted my own instincts about a man, those instincts were wrong, and the consequence was 3 years of very hard experience." "I know," he said. He had not moved at all. His voice was very quiet. "I need you to understand," she said, "that if I am wrong about you, it will be much worse than the last time, because what I feel is much larger than what I felt then. I did not know when I came here that this was going to happen, and I want to be clear that I did not intend it." "Neither did I," he said, "and I can't promise you certainty. What I can promise you is that I am exactly what you see. There is no hidden version. There is no other purpose. There is just this." She left her hand against his jaw for another moment, this careful study, this final reckoning with herself and with him, and then she said, "All right," in the voice of a woman who has made a decision that is irrevocable and knows it and has chosen it anyway. He put his hand over hers, the one against his jaw, and held it there, and looked at her with those layered November eyes and said nothing more for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Thank you for trusting me. Don't make me regret it," she said, which she intended as a warning but which came out as something much closer to a prayer. "I won't," he said, just those 2 words. But in his voice they had the weight of a document, a deed, something signed and filed and permanent. The trial in Abilene took place in March of 1883. Frances rode up with Cyrus and Marcus and Culpeper, leaving Thomas in Dora Capwell's cheerful care. The journey was 2 days by wagon, and Frances spent most of it thinking about what she was going to say and not thinking about the man driving the wagon beside her, which proved impossible because he was right there. They talked during those 2 days in a way they had not quite talked before, the way that people talk when movement and landscape give conversation permission to go places that static rooms sometimes will not allow. He told her more about his brother William, who had died in the fever epidemic of 1873, who had been funny and impractical, and who Cyrus had loved completely. He told her about coming to Texas afterward alone, with the particular kind of grief that doubles as determination, and building the ranch one fence post at a time. She told him about Kansas City, about what it had been like to grow up in her mother's house, the bread and lavender water, about learning to read properly from a school teacher who came to their church, and who told her that a woman with an education is a woman who cannot be entirely cornered, which Frances had found to be only partly true, but had never quite stopped believing. She told him about the things she had figured out in the hard years, about her own resilience, about the particular competence she had discovered she possessed when circumstances required it. She told him these things not with pride but with a kind of clarity, as a person presents their actual inventory, because he was offering her the same thing, and it seemed important to be honest in return. On the second evening, camped on the road north, with Marcus diplomatically asleep on the far side of the fire and the sky brilliant and enormous above them, Cyrus took her hand. He did it simply, without announcement, just reached across the few inches of space between them where they were sitting near the fire and put his hand around hers, and she let him, and they sat like that for a long time looking at the stars while the fire died down. "I want to ask you something," he said eventually. "Ask." "When this is done, when Vane is dealt with and Culpepper has finished his work, I want to know if you would consider staying at the ranch." She looked at him sidelong. "I live at the ranch." "Not as the housekeeper," he said, "as my wife, if that is something you could want." The fire snapped and sent up a brief spray of orange sparks. The stars continued their indifferent and magnificent burning overhead. "You are not a man who does things slowly," she said. "I've been thinking about this for a year," he said. "I don't think this qualifies as rushing." She considered that. He was right that it did not qualify as rushing by most reasonable measures. She considered other things as well, the evidence she had been accumulating for 2 years, the pattern of it, the consistency, the way his character had displayed itself in 100 small moments and several large ones, the way he spoke to Thomas and the way he had faced Vane and the way he had held her hand against his injured jaw in December and just waited. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, you'll consider it, or yes." "Yes," she said more firmly. "Yes, I'll be your wife. Yes." He turned to look at her, and his expression in the firelight was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, something purely and completely open, like a door swinging wide in a house where all the windows have finally been opened. He leaned forward and kissed her, soft and certain, and it was nothing at all like the performance of a man who is doing a social thing. It was just honest. Everything about him was honest. She had not been wrong about him. From across the fire, without opening his eyes, Marcus said, "Finally," in a tone of deep professional satisfaction. Frances laughed against Cyrus's mouth, and he laughed against hers, and even on the cold Texas road with the ground hard and the journey not yet finished, she felt something she recognized as happiness, real and grounded in hers. The trial went well, which is to say Culpepper was exactly as good as advertised, and the documents from Frances's tin box were exactly as useful as he had predicted, and Hector Vane's practices were laid out before Judge Hartley in their full and unpleasant detail over 3 days of testimony from 5 families, with Frances's testimony particularly clear and particular. Vane had expensive lawyers who tried to reframe everything, but they were working against physical evidence that had not been touched, unaltered signatures and altered ones side by side, and the testimony of 4 other people who could corroborate the pattern. Hector Vane was found liable on 4 counts of fraudulent debt construction and ordered to repay with significant interest. His land acquisitions based on those debts were declared void. He was not imprisoned, because 1883 Texas had its limitations in terms of consequences for powerful men, but he was financially reduced in a way from which he would not recover, and the county knew it, and the county had opinions about it. Frances had not expected to feel as much as she felt when the judgment came. She had expected relief, which she felt, but she had not expected the quality of it, which was the specific relief of a person who has been carrying a weight so long that they had partially stopped noticing its weight, and then set it down, and suddenly the difference is revelatory. She stood in the Abilene courthouse with Culpepper and Marcus on one side and Cyrus on the other, and she felt the difference of it in her whole body. Cyrus put his arm around her shoulders in public in front of Culpepper and Marcus and various other persons who were witnesses to the scene. She did not step away from it. They were married in Dusty Creek in April of 1883, on a Saturday that was warm and slightly windy, in the church on the corner of Main and 2nd, which was a plain limestone building with wooden pews and colored glass in the windows that threw colored light across the proceedings. Dora Capwell cried, which she had told Frances she was going to do regardless of what Frances thought about that. Thomas stood beside Cyrus through the ceremony with the composed gravity of a 7-year-old, who considers this outcome both correct and long overdue. The minister read the words and they said the words back, and when Cyrus put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother and that he had brought out from the bottom of a trunk with a slight defiant expression, as though daring her to find it insufficient, she felt the permanence of it as something real and physical, not as ceremony but as fact. She kissed him in front of the whole congregation with considerably more warmth than was strictly conventional, and the congregation, which had been watching the entire business with the avid interest of a small community that has had a front-row seat to a developing situation, reacted with great enthusiasm. The summer after the wedding was the most beautiful summer Frances could remember. Not because it was objectively extraordinary. The weather was ordinary West Texas summer weather, hot and occasionally violent with sudden storms, and the work of the ranch did not diminish because of any domestic happiness, and there were hard days and exhausting days and days when everything went wrong in 3 different ways simultaneously. But the quality of the ordinary was different now. She woke up in the morning in the main bedroom, which was larger than her housekeeper's rooms, and had a window that faced east so the morning light came in flat and golden and full of promise. And Cyrus was there, already awake half the time, reading or just lying thinking with his hands behind his head in the particular comfortable stillness of a man who has found his center. Thomas had become a different child in ways that were small and enormous simultaneously. He was still Thomas, still serious and curious and slightly solemn in his approach to everything, but something in him had settled. He had stopped the anxious checking that Frances had noticed without quite naming, the way he used to look at her and then at the door as if calculating odds. He did not do that anymore. He had believed what Cyrus had said to him in the street, and Cyrus had been exactly that, steady, consistent, present, patient with the boy's endless questions and occasional tests, because children test the things they have been promised. There was one afternoon in July when Thomas had thrown an absolutely magnificent tantrum over something trivial, the kind of tantrum designed to see how much pressure a person's steadiness could take before it cracked. Frances was in the kitchen and she heard the whole thing from the yard, Cyrus's voice, never raised, never sharp, saying the same calm things in the same calm way while Thomas escalated through 3 stages of theatrical grief and then, finding no purchase, simply stopped. The silence afterward, and then Thomas's voice, quieter, saying he was sorry, and Cyrus's voice saying he knew and that was all right. She had pressed her hand over her mouth and stood very still in the kitchen for a moment, feeling something that she did not immediately try to identify because it was too large and too real. In August, she told Cyrus she thought she was pregnant. She told him in the morning before breakfast at the kitchen table with the coffee between them, because there was no reason to be theatrical about it, and because she was not sure yet how she felt and she wanted to see how he felt first. He set down his coffee cup with very deliberate care and looked at her. "When?" he said. "February, I think. Dr. Haynes will know better." He reached across the table and put both his hands around both of hers and looked at her with his entire face completely open. The full, unguarded look that she had come to know was his real face, the one underneath the everyday steadiness. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am more than all right," she said. "I am extraordinary." She paused. "I am also somewhat terrified, if we're being precise." "That seems appropriate," he said. "I am also somewhat terrified." "Good," she said. "We'll be terrified together." He brought her hands up and kissed them, both of them, and she felt the warmth of it go all the way through her. Thomas received the news with characteristic solemnity, thought about it for approximately 45 seconds, and then said, "I want a brother." He said it with the decisive certainty of someone announcing a preference they have researched carefully. "I've thought about it, and a brother would be better." "The baby will be what the baby is," Frances said. "I know," Thomas said. "But I'd prefer a brother." It was a boy, as Thomas had diplomatically requested, born in February of 1884 on a night when the wind was rattling the shutters and Dr. Haynes was there, and so was Dora Capwell, who had installed herself as essential to the proceedings regardless of anyone's invitation. Cyrus was in the hall outside the bedroom door, which was the customary arrangement, though he was clearly finding the customary arrangement difficult. The boy came into the world loudly and completely, and Frances, who was exhausted in a way that felt like she had been turned inside out, held him against her chest and felt the particular overwhelming love of a thing you have made that has nevertheless arrived as a complete surprise in terms of its specific reality. Cyrus was allowed in after a short interval, and he came to the bedside and sat on the edge of it and looked at the baby, and then at Frances with that completely open face. "He's all right," he said. "He is very loud and very red and entirely perfect," she said. He reached out and touched the baby's hand with one finger, the careful touch of a large man who is aware of his own size relative to small things. The baby's fingers closed around his with the involuntary grip of newborns, and Cyrus made a sound that was not quite a word, just a sound, low and undone. "What do we call him?" Frances asked. Cyrus had been thinking about this. She knew he had been thinking about it because he had the slightly too deliberate air of a man performing casualness about something he has already decided. "I'd like to call him William," he said. "If you agree, William, his brother, the funny, impractical one who had been buried on the hill 3 miles east." "I agree," Frances said. Thomas, who had been permitted to look in from the doorway, said, "Hello, William," with the grave formality of an 8-year-old who has been waiting for this and has prepared accordingly. William grew. He grew the way babies do, with complete indifference to any schedule or expectation. And he was loud where Thomas was quiet and physical, where Thomas was cerebral and headlong, where Thomas was careful. And Thomas adored him with the slightly bewildered love of a child who has asked for something, and received a version of it he did not anticipate. Cyrus managed the difference between them with the same steadiness he managed everything, not pretending they were the same child, not applying the same approach to both, and expecting identical results. He had long, serious conversations with Thomas about cattle management and account keeping. He chased William around the yard and sat in the dirt to play horse with carved wooden animals, and was apparently unbothered by either the dirt or the indignity. The ranch itself was growing. The lawsuit and veins reduction had created opportunities in the county, land available for reasonable prices for the first time in years, and Cyrus had expanded carefully, adding 200 acres to the south, and a new grazing rotation that improved the cattle weight going to the railheads. He had hired 2 more men, bringing the crew to 6, and the operation was prospering in the steady, unhurried way of a man who has always been more interested in sustainability than spectacle. Frances had become, in the years since the wedding, something she had not quite planned to become, which was his full partner in the business. This had happened organically, through the account keeping and the supplier negotiations, and the occasional need to represent the ranch's interests in town when Cyrus was out on the range. She was good at it, which did not surprise her, because she had always been good at the practical intelligence of managing complicated systems, and a working ranch was a complicated system. What surprised her was how much she loved it. Not the narrow, specific task of keeping house, though she did that with care, but the larger enterprise of it, the whole living thing of the ranch and the land, and the community of people who depended on it working correctly. She had not known she wanted this kind of work, this kind of scale, because she had not previously had the opportunity to find out. Dora Capwell told her, over tea in the spring of 1885, that she had become formidable, which she said with great satisfaction as though she deserved some personal credit. "I was always formidable," Frances said. "I just needed better conditions." "Cyrus Morgan is very good conditions," Dora said. "He is," Frances agreed and meant it in every sense. In the summer of 1885, Hector Vane left Dusty Creek. The word that came was that he had gone to New Mexico, which was far enough. Frances received this news and felt very little, which she considered the appropriate amount. The history was real and it was hers and it always would be, but it had stopped being a weight. It was just a thing that had happened, part of the map of how she had gotten here. Thomas was 10 that summer, and he had begun accompanying Cyrus on the longer range rides, learning the land from horseback the way it really had to be learned. He was a good rider, careful and attentive, and he was developing the eye for cattle that Cyrus had told him took time and close attention. He was also beginning to talk about school, real school, in Abilene or eventually further, because he had read through everything accessible in Dusty Creek and was hungry for more. Frances had begun writing letters on that subject. She had been corresponding with a school administrator in Abilene about enrollment possibilities, and more recently with a women's college in St. Louis that had indicated Thomas might be considered for a scholarship in 3 or 4 years if his preparation was adequate. This project gave her considerable satisfaction of the fierce protective kind. "You are planning his entire future," Cyrus observed one evening, watching her write letters at the kitchen table. "Someone has to," she said. "He might want to run the ranch," Cyrus said. "He might," she agreed. "He might also want to be a lawyer or a doctor or a college professor. I intend for him to have options." Cyrus was quiet for a moment and she looked up and found him watching her with the full attentive look that she had long since stopped being surprised by but had never fully stopped feeling. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just looking at you." "Is there something wrong?" "Quite the opposite," he said. She returned to her letters, but she was smiling in a way she did not try to conceal. William turned to and began talking with great fluency and absolutely no coherence, which Thomas found hilarious, and which Cyrus took completely seriously, responding to every indecipherable statement with genuine consideration, as though the ideas were clear and worth engaging. Frances watched this, and felt the brightness in her chest that she had come to understand was simply what love felt like when it was the real kind, when it had been tested and had held. In the autumn of 1885, Frances realized she was pregnant again. She told Cyrus the same way as before at the kitchen table in the morning, and he received it the same way, with both hands around hers and the completely open face, and she told him she was thinking it might be a girl this time. "Is Thomas still opposed to girls?" Cyrus asked. "Thomas is 10. His opinion on the subject will evolve." William, who was nearby and following the conversation with his typical intense blankness, said "baby" with great authority, which was apparently his contribution. "Yes," Cyrus told him, "a baby." William considered this. "Okay," he said, with the philosophical acceptance of a 2-year-old for whom the world is still mostly manageable one syllable at a time. The girl arrived in April of 1886, which was a beautiful month, and they named her Clara, and she came into the world with much less drama than her brother had and lay looking up at Frances with the particular ancient calm of certain newborns who seemed to have arrived already composed. Thomas, who was now 10 and a half and whose opinions had indeed evolved, looked at Clara with careful interest and said that she had very small hands. "She does," Cyrus confirmed. "They'll get bigger," Thomas said helpfully. "They will," Cyrus agreed. William looked at Clara for a long time from his position being held in Dora Capwell's arms, and then looked at Frances, and then looked at Cyrus, and then said "mine" with proprietary satisfaction, which Frances chose to interpret charitably. In the years that followed, the ranch became what it had been promising to become since the beginning, the kind of place that runs on the steady accumulation of good work and good faith. The cattle operation was profitable. The land was well maintained. The people who worked there stayed, which is its own kind of testimony. Thomas went to school in Abilene at 13, which was 1888, boarding with a family Cyrus had known for years, coming home for summers and holidays. He was serious and excellent at his studies, and wrote long letters home that grew increasingly elaborate as his education advanced, until Frances sometimes had to show them to Cyrus because she wanted to share the specific pleasure of them. William grew into a boy who was loud and curious and cheerful, with his father's steadiness beginning to emerge under the surface energy, visible in moments of decision, moments when something required patience. Clara grew into a child who watched everything with careful, intelligent eyes, and who had a particular talent for drawing that emerged when she was 3, and that Frances encouraged with fierce devotion, ordering paper and pencils from the catalog in Abilene. The winter of 1888 was a hard winter, the kind the Texas plains occasionally delivered, with ice storms that came in waves and required real management of the cattle to prevent losses. Cyrus was in the field for days at a stretch, and Frances ran the domestic side of the operation, and managed the hands' logistics and wrote the supply orders, and kept the accounts and managed William's energy and Clara's need for continuous attention, with the competence of a woman who has long since stopped being surprised by the volume of things she can handle. On an evening in December when the ice had relented for a day and the sky had gone a deep winter blue and the yard was quiet for the first time in a week, Cyrus came in from the field, cold and tired in the specific deep way of a man who has been working at the limit of his endurance, and she had the hot meal ready and the stove banked high and the kitchen warm, and he stood in the doorway for a moment just looking at it all. "Come in," she said. "You'll let the cold in." He came in and she took his coat and he sat at the table and she put the food in front of him, and he caught her hand as she set it down, not dramatically, just the simple catch of a man who wants a moment. "Thank you," he said. "You've been thanking me for 6 years," she said. "You don't have to." "I want to," he said. "I know I don't have to. I want to." She sat down across from him at the table, which was their table now, absolutely and completely, with the lamp between them and the sound of William murmuring something in his sleep from the room beyond and Clara's steady breathing from hers, and the ice tapping against the windows in the pause between storms. She looked at him across the table and she thought about the afternoon in the street outside the general store, how she had stood there with Thomas pressed against her side and the world feeling like it was made of broken things, and this man had crouched down and said those words that had cut through everything like a line to solid ground. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About the day we met," she said. "Outside the general store," he said. He remembered it exactly. She knew he did. "I didn't know what to do with you," she said. "I had very good reasons to be finished with men who made promises. I remember you looking at me like you were calculating the odds of my sincerity," he said. "Very precise, very suspicious. I was not wrong to be suspicious." "No," he agreed. "You were not wrong. You were very right to be suspicious, and you gave me considerably more chance than my record with you justified." "Your record with me," she said, "consisted of 2 months of being a reasonable and entirely appropriate employer." "Which is not much to go on," he said. "It was more than you think," she said. "Consistency is more than you think when a person has learned not to count on it." He looked at her with that completely open face, across 6 years and 3 children and a lawsuit and a hard winter and an entire life that had been built in this place from 2 separate people with separate pasts and separate wounds and separate kinds of courage. "Are you happy?" he asked. Not the social question, not the polite form, the real one. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things anymore. "Yes," she said, "I am profoundly happy. Which still occasionally surprises me." "Good," he said. "It still occasionally surprises me too. I consider that a sign that we're both paying attention." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the way he had put his hand over hers 100 times, and he turned his hand palm up so that hers was resting in it. And they sat like that in the warm kitchen while the ice storm gathered itself outside for another pass at the plains. And it was ordinary and it was everything. In the spring of 1889, Thomas came home from his 2nd year in Abilene and announced that he wanted to study law, which nobody in the house was surprised by, least of all Frances, who had quietly been routing conversations in that direction for 3 years. He was 14 by then, with Cyrus's steadiness and something of Gerald's easy good looks that she had made her peace with, because Thomas was Thomas, and none of that belonged to Gerald. Cyrus had taken Thomas out to ride the boundaries of the ranch on the first morning he was home, and when they came back in the evening, Thomas's eyes were bright with something that was not just the wind. "He's going to give me the South Quarter," Thomas told Frances, with the kind of barely contained excitement that he usually kept more firmly under control. "Give you?" Frances said. "In trust," Cyrus said, coming in behind him. "A piece of land in his name, something to come back to. Something to know he has." Thomas was looking at Cyrus with the particular look of a boy who has been given something that goes far beyond the stated object of the gift. "You don't have to do that," Frances said. "I know I don't have to," Cyrus said, and there was the echo of their kitchen conversation in December, the deliberate "I want to," and she heard it and said nothing more about it. Thomas went to Cyrus and held out his hand, and Cyrus shook it with the formal seriousness the moment called for. And then Thomas put his other arm around Cyrus's ribs and held on, briefly and fiercely. The hug of a 14-year-old boy who is working very hard to manage his feelings about what has just been given to him. Cyrus's hand came up and rested on the back of the boy's head, steady and unhurried and absolutely certain, the same quality it had carried in the street outside the general store 7 years before. Frances stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall and looked at them and felt something that was not quite sadness and not quite joy, but was the particular emotion that lives between the two, the feeling of a thing being exactly right that you could not have planned and would not have chosen and cannot imagine being without. William appeared from somewhere at high speed and inserted himself into the embrace with complete lack of self-consciousness, which disrupted the solemnity entirely and made Thomas laugh. And then Clara appeared from behind Frances's skirt and tottered toward the group with her arms out, because she would not be left out of anything that was happening. She never would. And Cyrus scooped her up and she grabbed his ear and told him something urgent and probably important in her 2-year-old's partially comprehensible language. And the whole thing dissolved into the ordinary beautiful chaos of a family being itself. Frances leaned against the doorframe and watched all of it and did not try to manage any of it and did not look away from any of it. This was what had been built here. This was what had grown from a desperate woman in a difficult position and a man who crouched down in the dust and made a promise he had no obligation to make, because he was built that way, because that was who he was, because steadiness is not something you perform on select occasions but something you either are or you are not. He was. He had been, he would be. Later that night, after the children were in bed and the house was settled and the spring night was warm enough that the bedroom window could be opened to the sound of the live oak by the corner of the house, Frances lay in the dark and Cyrus was beside her and she said into the quiet, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "When I came here," she said, "when I first came to the ranch to ask about the housekeeper position, I had decided I was done with the business of trusting people. I had decided I was going to manage alone and keep everything clear and uncomplicated and not need anyone more than the minimum." "I know," he said. "You knew." "I could see you thinking it," he said. "It was in your face when you rode up, very self-contained, very precise, very clearly about to conduct an interview." "I was about to conduct an interview," she said. "You conducted a very thorough interview," he said. "I was slightly intimidated." She smiled in the dark. "You were not." "I was somewhat intimidated," he said. "You were very clear about what you wanted and what you were prepared to offer and what you were not prepared to negotiate on. It was impressive." "I was terrified," she said. "I was performing, not terrified." "I know that too," he said. "I could see both things, the performance and what was underneath it." She was quiet for a moment. "You have always been able to see both things. You are not particularly difficult to read," he said, "when you're not specifically trying to be." "I was specifically trying to be." "Yes," he said, But you're warm by nature, and warmth comes through regardless of the effort." He paused. "It was the first thing I noticed about you, the warmth you were working very hard to manage." She turned toward him in the dark. He was a shape and a warmth and a presence that had become as familiar as anything she had ever known. "I am glad," she said, "that Dora Capwell mentioned your name." "I am going to be grateful to Dora Capwell for the rest of my life," he said. "I intend to express that gratitude at the appropriate volume whenever the occasion presents itself." "She already knows," Frances said. "She is very satisfied with herself." "She has earned it," he said. She put her hand against his chest, above his heart, the way she sometimes did, just to feel the steady, particular rhythm of it. He put his hand over hers. "I love you," she said. She had said it many times in 6 years, and it had never felt smaller or more automatic. It was always specific and always fully meant. "I love you," he said, "same quality, same weight." The live oak moved against the window, and the night moved over the ranch and the land that lay around it, the south quarter that Thomas would come back to, the grass that was growing toward another summer, the fences that were maintained, the cattle that were watched, all of it the product of years of steady care and honest work, all of it the shape of a life that had been built rather than happened, chosen rather than stumbled into. Frances Maddox, who was Frances Morgan now and had been for 6 years, lay in the dark and listened to her husband's breathing even out into sleep beside her, and felt the fullness of it, all of it, everything that had been survived and built and chosen, the hard years and the good ones, and all the ordinary days in between that were the real substance of a life. Not the dramatic moments, but the morning coffee and the account books, and the cattle and the children and the hand across the table, and the steady presence of a man who had meant what he said to a crying boy on a dusty street in Texas in the autumn of 1882. She slept. Outside, the live oak moved and the stars burned over the flat, enormous country, and the Morgan ranch lay quiet and whole under them, fenced and maintained and full of living things, and the morning was already on its way. Thomas did become a lawyer, as Frances had known he would. He studied in Abilene and then in Austin, and he came home for summers and for Christmas, and he wrote the long, elaborate letters that Frances and Cyrus read together at the kitchen table. He was admitted to the bar in 1895, when he was 20 years old, and he went into practice in Abilene with a firm that had a particular interest in land rights, and the kinds of cases that Nate Culpepper had shown him were worth fighting, which was not a coincidence. William took to the ranch the way water takes to the course it was meant to run. He was loud and physical and headlong as a child, but as he grew into his teens, he acquired the patience that the work demanded, the eye for cattle, the feel for land and weather and what the animals needed. He was Cyrus made younger and louder, and he loved every square foot of the Morgan ranch with a depth that needed no explaining. Clara drew everything. She drew the horses and the cattle and the hands and the hills, and the way the light fell on the caprock in the late afternoon. She drew her mother and her father and her brothers and Dora Capwell, who was delighted, and the live oak by the corner of the house. She sent drawings to Thomas at school, and Thomas sent them back with written comments that were both encouraging and somewhat literary, because Thomas had become that kind of person. In 1896, Frances turned 40, and Cyrus turned 47, and they had been married for 13 years, and the ranch had grown to 800 acres. And the children were becoming their adult shapes, and the world had changed in the ways it changes. The railroad coming closer, and the telegraph lines running everywhere, and the old open range giving way to the fenced and managed land that was both loss and progress depending on who you were and what you had. Cyrus was gray at the temples, which Frances found distinguished and told him so, and he said she was being kind, and she said she was being accurate, and he said there was no arguing with her on matters of observation, which was true and had been true from the beginning. She found him on the hill east of the ranch one evening, where his brother William was buried, which he visited sometimes in the way that people visit the graves of people they loved, not from grief any more, but from the need to speak to someone who knew you when you were a different person. She sat beside him on the grass, and he was looking at the horizon, which was the West Texas horizon, everything and enormous, all that sky. "I wish he had known this," he said. He did not need to specify who. "Tell me about him again," she said. She had heard about William Morgan many times and always asked for more, because it was something she could give Cyrus, this interest, this keeping alive. So he told her about his brother, the funny, impractical one who had laughed easily and lost money at cards with good humor, and who had followed him west and died on a summer evening of a fever that should not have been fatal and was. He told it slowly, in the way of something that has been told many times and has settled into its true shape. She listened all the way through. The sun went down while he talked, and the sky changed through its colors, and the stars appeared, and she was close beside him on the grass, and his voice moved through the dark, and when he was finished she said, "He would have liked all of this. He would have liked you happy." "Yes," Cyrus said. "He would have been very pleased with himself about it." She laughed. "He would have taken credit, completely and without shame," Cyrus said, and smiled in the dark. "He was that kind of person." They sat on the hill a while longer, in the comfortable silence of people who have been together long enough that silence is its own language, and then they walked back down to the lit windows of the house and went inside to their life. The Morgan ranch continued. The Morgan family continued. The years layered over each other the way good years do, not without difficulty, but with the fundamental structure intact, the foundation solid, the thing built to last rather than to impress. And in all of it, through all of it, the constant was this: a man who had meant what he said, a woman who had been right to trust him, finally and completely. A boy who had been crying in a dusty street and had been answered with something real. A boy who grew up knowing what steady looked like, because it had been there every morning when he woke up, and every evening when the lamp was lit, and in every fence post maintained, and every promise kept, and every hand held across every table in every season of all the years that followed. That was the whole of it. That was all of it. That was enough.